Hi there. In this video, I want you to think about the fundamental questions or themes of the Brothers Karamazov. So pause your videos now and see if you could pose questions like, what are the events that drive the plot? What are the key issues that are raised, the questions that are raised that need to be resolved in order for this to be a satisfying story? So pause your videos now and see if you can write down some of these fundamental questions that you think the book is posing to us. Okay, that was your last chance. All right, I'm going to start talking about. Here's a host of the ones that I've come up with. Is there a God? So there's these interesting dialogues between Alexei and Ivan that all of the Karamazovs get into about whether there's a God. Now, it might seem like this is just a random theological question tacked on to this story about all of this family strife. Like it's the story, the plot line is driven by the melodrama of the characters. Like Katya and Dmitri, are they going to get married? How are they going to resolve their relationship? Or is Fyodor and Grushenka, are they going to end up together? Will Ivan ever find love? Can Alyosha actually keep this from devolving from melodrama into tragedy, where his family members just start killing each other? These are all central questions of the plot. So if you came up with any questions like these, I think that's great. Another one that I think is maybe overwhelmed by the relationship questions is just this: can Dmitri settle his debts or not? He is constantly indebted to other people. He's obsessed with clearing his name. The way in which his father owes him money, and yet, ironically, at the same time, he seems to be indebted to his father because his father has all of these bills with which Dmitri has signed that for all the money that he owes him. And then eventually Grushenka takes over some of that debt too. Dmitri is deeply indebted to everyone. So what I want you to think about is this question: Dmitri settling his debts. You might not have come up with that, but I think that question and the question, is there a God? These are the sort of the two outliers. I think these central group of questions are the more obvious plot questions. But these two questions, I think, are actually at a philosophical level, what's really driving the action. And all of these other relationship questions are going to just serve the answer to help us answer this question: is there a God, and can Dmitri settle his debts? Because, and this is the other thing I want to try to convince you of, these are actually the same question. Whether Dmitri can settle his debt or not is actually the same question as to whether there is a God. Whether that might seem fanciful and impossible to you, but I think by the end of the story, you might agree with me. Here's how we can see the relationship between them. Because the question, can Dmitri settle his debts, is related to the question, is he going to actually be successful in the novel or not? Settling his debts is set up by the plot as one of the key mechanisms by which he can actually have a happy ending. He can find some kind of redemption in the story. Now, one can only get redemption in a spiritual sense if there is like a redeemer, or if the religious expression of redemption is redemption through the spirit or through God, especially in the realm of the Russian novel and setting that we have here, where Russian Orthodoxy is the backdrop. That's the faith of Alexei, and Father Zosima, the saintly monk who they go to for arbitration. So what I want to challenge you to think about is that the concept of debt that Dmitri is facing here is actually a metaphor for his spiritual situation. See, he is obsessed, remember, he has this sense of nobility and is obsessed with his own faults. And his debt is sort of a physical manifestation of the condition of his inner spirit. It is like, because debt is really a great religious metaphor for the spiritual state of sinfulness, or the state of needing salvation. So this idea, if only I could settle matters with my father, you could read this in religious terms, like in Christianity and Russian Orthodoxy, that's the religious setting for the story. You need to settle things with your God the Father in order for you to be in the right spiritual state. So Dmitri's fundamental financial situation is really a spiritual situation, or it's all metaphorical for it. And this is what partly manifests and makes so complicated his relationship with Katerina. So she sees it, she has this idea like, look, I'm rich now, I can just pay off all of your debts. And you might be wondering in the story, like, what is Dmitri hung up about? Why can't he just accept her money? She's got plenty of it. And in some ways he did help her, so he's not being a total scoundrel and letting her help him. So what's wrong with that? But at a spiritual level, that is what is so impossible for Dmitri. He just says no, because if you think about it, other people, she can't just settle his spiritual debts. He needs to heal himself. He has this inner conflicted nature, the human condition. He is both angel and insect. And only if he can figure out how to heal himself is he going to actually get salvation. He can't just let her pay off and buy his salvation for him. This idea that debt is actually a metaphor, I think one sees it all the time. It's wonderfully done by Bruce Springsteen in this line from the song Atlantic City, that I got debts no honest man can pay. This is exactly Dimitri's condition. See, this debt here is like standing in as this metaphor for original sin, that each person has to figure out how to settle it. And maybe the difficulty of the human condition is that we seemingly can't figure out how to settle it. That's the trouble. That is our sinful nature. And figuring out whether we can find redemption in one way or another is precisely the fate that Dmitri is living throughout this novel. So that's why I actually think there's a deep connection between these two questions. Because if he can settle his debts, that means he can find salvation and redemption. And that, in a sense, proves that there is a God, or that the condition of success of Dmitri settling his debts is that there is a God, at least in some existential sense or other. Okay, now, so this is one way of trying to help you see that these dialogues that the characters engage in about deeply theological and religious matters are not just sort of toss off lines in order to fill some of the airspace. After all, when people make movies, they want the movie to be as short as possible. Every minute of screen time costs them money. So this is meant to be deeply significant when these characters are arguing about religion. Yvonne is defending the atheistic scientific line. You know, men have to have something to believe in, and if there weren't such a God, then they just would have invented it. He's got a very interesting and rationally defended intellectual position on these matters, and this partly is expressive of his existential bearing. He's not fighting for redemption the same way Dmitri is. So what we have to do is understand how he could get it by the end of the story, or whether he's going to get into this state. It's after these bits of dialogue that Alexei says to Dmitri that we all need love. So this question of our need for love is set in direct juxtaposition with this question about the state of God. And of course, you know, in the New Testament, it is Jesus who is identified as the vehicle, the mechanism, the bringer of love to humanity. So love and the existence of God and Dimitri's debt or sinful nature is the central theme of this story. Okay, I gave you a couple of lines just to show how continually this comes up in Dimitri's mind, that he's obsessed with his indebtedness, and he's also obsessed with his depravity, that he needs help. He asks his brother to pray for him. He dislikes himself. He is abhorred by his own insect nature. And all of this is wrapped up in the fact that he calls himself, I am a Karamazov. And he says in several places that Alexei, you are a Karamazov too. And Ivan, you are a Karamazov too. To be a Karamazov is to just be, they are all stand-ins for the human condition. This is one of those epic novels with a grand scope. That's how I read these references. I am a Karamazov. I am someone struggling with the human condition, and we'll see by the end of the story whether he gets it resolved or not. Now, I didn't address the final sets of characters and what forms of despair they might exist in. So let me close by just raising this question for you. Let's talk about each of the final characters. What about Yvonne? I said before that there are several different forms of Kierkegaardian despair, not having a self, not being aware of it, etc. I want you to tell me, where do you think Yvonne stands? Let me see if you figured his character out or not. All right, pause your videos now so you can try to answer this question. Okay, now you might have said Yvonne is not in despair. I think that's an interesting answer, but I don't think that's his position. I think Yvonne is deeply conflicted. It's not that he has no reconciliation. Remember, this was Dimitri's status. I think Ivan thinks he has the world figured out, but he doesn't. He thinks that his scientific intellectual atheism settles matters for him. He's not running around like Dimitri as if he is sort of on edge and is struggling to contain his emotions. Dimitri almost looks like a child to the reserved, the cool and collected Ivan. But Ivan actually, his position is sort of distanced and mocked by some of the other characters. And we see that in the unsuccessful way in which he's trying to interact with Katya. He has never had a close friend. He has always sought self-sufficiency and detachment from others. And now that's coming back to haunt him because he can't develop a successful and fulfilling relationship with Katerina. So Ivan needs human connection just as much as everybody else, despite the fact that he thinks his detached self has solved all of the intellectual puzzles and problems. And in his own way, he has this kind of smug pride in his own smarts in figuring things out and not believing the silly religious spiritual stuff that Alexei and the other characters might. But that does not mean the novel endorses the idea that he has everything figured out. And you've seen some seeds of this already with his relationship with Katerina, but we're going to see it even more clearly as the story goes on. Okay, how about the other brother, Alyosha or Alexei? What is his state? So pause your videos now and try to decide what you think about him. Okay. Again, I think a lot of people might say he's not in despair, and I think that there's some ways in which that's defensible. He's not racked with guilt or with indecision, with a conflicted, passionate nature. He's not berating himself about his insect and angel side like all the other characters. He seems to be so angelic and cool, calm, and collected all of the time that you might think he's not in despair at all. I think that's actually wrong. I think he also has a kind of unsuccessful reconciliation because he has a type of simple-minded faith that actually Dostoevsky is going to want us to question. It's quite similar. It's sort of analogous to the way in which Kierkegaard questions simple-minded Christianity and the Sunday school version of the story of Abraham. Dostoevsky has a subtle, complicated view about spirituality too. The trouble is, though, so this is where I really feel conflicted because basically I think his character becomes very one-dimensional in the movie. So if you're not reading the whole novel, reading along with us, I would say maybe Not in Despair is the right view of him in the movie because he's more one-dimensional. I think in the novel, I'm going to give you some sections to read later on that show you this. His character is much more complicated in the novel, and that is actually essential to understanding Dostoevsky's whole vision. So his unsuccessful reconciliation, in my opinion, is actually the right way to think about his character. But we haven't really seen the full manifestation of that yet. Now, none of these folks then have come up with not having a self. So let me ask you this. Do you think that there's any character in these stories who would fall into this boat, who don't have a self? So pause your videos and see if you can try to answer this. Okay. I'm not sure what you made of it if my question was too enigmatic. You see, we did not talk about Smerdyakov yet. I should have given you a picture of Smerdyakov, the fourth brother. This is Grigory, and Grigory has this line where he criticizes Smerdyakov as born of the devil's son and a righteous woman. See, Smerdyakov is the forgotten Karamazov son. He's the one who is continually maltreated because. And this can really seem completely inhumane from a modern perspective. So you have to think about the ways in which this patriarchal, dated mindset was thinking about Smerdyakov as being the child born out of wedlock, and that gave him a kind of a secondary social status. And he's even mistreated continually by his father. Now, Fyodor, I think, is a terrible father to all of the sons, but even most obviously, he's a terrible father to Smerdyakov. And in some ways, Smerdyakov really is an amalgamation of his father's influence and his mother. And this character we don't get developed in the novel or the movie. She is not even hardly mentioned in the movie. The novel, we get her backstory, and she is portrayed in some ways as sort of in a subaltern way, as a barely human or questionably human way. She is of the lowest class, and is sort of a social outcast in the way in which like mental illness was pathologized in older times. So to understand the character of Smerdyakov, I think it's very difficult if all you have is the movie's glimpse of him. But I think there's ways in which the despair that Smerdyakov is in is actually one of not even properly having a self. And this emerges out of this relationship of Fyodor and Lizaveta. Let me give you a couple of passages where I think this comes across in the novel. This is not part of the readings. But he's continually described as the lackey, as just the servant for the Karamazovs. And of course, this is just him being horribly treated. And what that I think shows is he is the character who has received the least familial love for everyone. Because remember, Grigory at least was the father to the other Karamazov sons. But even Grigory thinks Smerdyakov is a monster. He calls him Balaam's ass, or a wicked character. So he thinks Smerdyakov is the person who is the most devoid of any nurturing or loving relationship. And he also, so this is Smerdyakov, he's quite shy. He has a lot of shame. He's also arrogant and looks down on other people. He lacks being sociable. So Smerdyakov, I think maybe you can see here a little bit better how he's actually like an exaggerated version of Ivan. Ivan is the person who's quite arrogant in his sort of philosophical smugness. Ivan is also quick to feel shame and has to arrange his affairs in ways so that he can avoid it at all costs. Ivan is also quite solitary, but Grigory describes Smerdyakov as completely lacking in gratitude, completely lacking in morality, or any kind of social relationships. And in Dostoevsky's worldview, social relationships, nurturing relationships, the relationship of love, which is essentially something that involves other people, it's not a solitary thing, is what's key for Dostoevsky. And that's why we see that Smerdyakov, I think, really is the lowest form of despair in Dostoevsky's universe, as not even yet possessing a self. So I think each of these Karamazov characters is experiencing different types of existential despair, and we're going to see how their fates work out, how they can make sense of these difficult existential states that they're in. And even though Ivan and Alexei are both sort of unsuccessfully reconciling things, in my view, they're doing so in completely opposite ways. Sort of Ivan is denying his spiritual side, and Alexei is suppressing his passionate, his beastly side, his insect side. So in a sense, all five of them represent the five different states. And what we need to do is see who's going to end up here, who's going to actually find reconciliation and resolution by the end of the story. Okay, thank you.